You're listening to the Virtue Podcast, brought to you by the Great Hearts Institute. Good conversations around the great conversation. Welcome back to the Virtue Podcast, and it is my distinct pleasure today to welcome good colleague and friend, professor from the School of Civic and Economic Thought and Leadership at Arizona State University, Colleen Sheehan. Thanks, Colleen, for joining us. I have to, before I even let you say hello, I have to say just how thick your resume is. I mean, my goodness, you've served in public office, Pennsylvania House of Reps, right? In the State Board of Education there. You were an Earhart Fellow, Bradley Fellow, Marion Kennedy Smith Fellow, Garwood Fellow, James Madison Program Fellow. I think I first met you there. And then, of course, you've got this list of publications that follow. So when do you breathe, sleep, otherwise catch a meal with your husband, Jack?
You are the only one who's ever read my resume, Rob. That's a good thing. Yeah, sure. Life is busy, isn't it? But it is for everybody these days.
It is indeed. Well, you have done such a good service to the purposes of liberal education. And obviously, I now have gotten to meet you and work more closely because of your affiliation with ASU, and specifically SCETL, as it's called. But I would be interested, and I think our audience would be interested, to just get a little bit of the background of your own story, how it is that you came into liberal education, your journey, if you will, through the liberal arts and to eventual service as a professor and scholar. Could you tell us briefly about that?
Sure. I always think of that old Mary Tyler Moore episode, that guy Ted, who whenever they asked him a question, he said, well, it all started in a little radio. Rob, I actually grew up in a real small town in upstate New York with, my dad finished 8th grade because it was a depression, and my grandfather had a farm. And he was the oldest, and somebody had to get out of school and help because times were tough. Yep. But it enabled his next brother, whom he was always real close with and was my favorite uncle, Tom, to go to school and then to go to college and then to get a master's degree and become a history teacher and a principal. And the two of them were close their whole lives. They were, and my uncle Tom was like a second dad. And it's funny that there's this teacher in 7th and 8th grade. She taught English and Latin, Mrs. Booth. And my father had her the first year she ever taught before he left school. Mm-hmm. And I had her her last year before retirement, when her hands were crippled with arthritis, and but her spirit didn't skip a beat. I'll say a bit more about Mrs. Booth in a second, but basically I went on to college, a little small liberal arts college, which we read primary text and we wrote and we had seminar discussions, and it was fabulous. Mm-hmm. And then it just whetted my appetite for more. So I went on to graduate school. You know what I wanted to do? I wanted to know what justice was. I can't tell you I have the answer.
Just a small question there, right? Yeah,
I like studying the founding, and I especially like studying Jefferson. And I learned in graduate school, Jefferson taught me to study Madison. Mm-hmm. That it was his friend Madison who actually really understood things maybe a little bit more profoundly. Mm-hmm. So I studied political philosophy, American government, met wonderful people with whom I am still very good friends. The conversation continues because that's what education is. It's really not just something you do in school. Robert Frost said that it's like knitting. You put it down and you pick it up again.
That's right.
And I think what he meant was it's ideas that you knit about. Mm-hmm. You knit your brow, you think about. And it seems to me that that's what education is. One of my friends wrote a little piece and that said, the title of it was, Liberal Education Should Do More Than Just Liberate. And that always stuck with me, because if you're going to be free, you have to be free for some reason. You have
Yep,
to use your freedom for something.
that's right.
And it probably has to do, doesn't it, Rob, with something we call the good life.
Hmm.
You've seen those hats and shirts that say "Life is good."
Hmm.
Well, that motto actually, it comes from a student at Villanova.
Oh, is that right?
Yeah, so he and his brother have done pretty well, but I I think life is good if you add on this tagline: "Life is good if we make it good."
Hmm.
And that's what liberal education is about. Real quickly, back to Mrs. Booth.
Please.
One day in eighth grade, there was this student. I remember his name. I don't know if I should say it. This is a long time ago, but I'm going to say it. Kevin Jaquish, and he was acting out in class. And I remember this as if I were there. And he was a bit of a class clown and wasn't paying much attention. She stopped everything and she said, "Now I'm going to tell you why what you are doing is a problem. It's not just a problem for me." She said, "There's something called reputation."
Hmm.
And she went on to tell us what reputation meant and why it mattered. And I think every one of us in that class that day still remembers it.
Hmm. I am so glad that you mentioned Mrs. Booth, because you could quickly run ahead to the wonderful experiences that you had in school, college, graduate school, and those colleagues that you said you retained contact with, and forget the fact that in those formative years, in elementary school, in middle school, and high school, we encounter teachers who inspire us and who give us, just as you said, in a single episode, give us that sense that there is so much riding on it, so much is at stake if we want to be fully alive, if we want to be fully human. And Mrs. Booth, by giving you a little etymological and or exposition of the notion of reputation, has left an indelible mark, and certainly I think that's central to what we're trying to do with this classical liberal arts education in the schools that we represent at Great Hearts. So anyhow, without that, with that, let me ask: as you moved into the professorate, right, and in higher education, which again we associate with folks like Robert Frost, who, though he wasn't necessarily assigned to a particular institution, always found himself headed back to those colleges and universities because he felt like that was a good place for real and genuine community, this knitting circle, if you will. uh, I'm interested in what those pleasures are that you found in higher education and as your vocation, but also some of the difficulties working in the collegiate scene.
Yeah. Well, the difficulties would be university politics.
Mm.
Um, University politics are not particularly pleasant for the most part, um, because they're so petty. Someone once said the fights are so vicious because the stakes are so low.
Was that Kissinger? Yeah, it sounds familiar. Yep.
So, I mean, compared to actual politics, it's much worse in the academy.
Mm.
It's not as bad. At least when I was in Harrisburg, it wasn't as bad as it's certainly. It's just the way the university has become, unfortunately, and it's petty,
Hmm.
and there's so much narcissism.
Mm.
But most of all, there's something real serious behind all this, and that's the abandonment of liberal education, the
Mm.
abandonment of the mission, the purpose of liberal education. And in its stead, we have power politics, petty politics, and people who are very keen on doing things um, that have very little relevance to anyone's life.
Mm.
I mean, think about some of the things that are studied. Just think in political scientists. There's a reason statesmen don't read these political science reviews. There's nothing in them of any relevance, of any importance to real life. And so, and that's because of that whole fact value dichotomy, Rob, and just redefining what knowledge is. It's become this very just small, uninteresting little part of human and political life that really thoughtful people kind of ignore.
They turn away from. That's right.
Yep. Yeah.
Is it? If I can go down that line just a little further, and of course, there's a lot that goes into this, but in as much as scholarship has become arcane and erudition has been removed from the realities on the ground, do you see any way to bring it back? I mean, just and again, I know that's a huge question, but are there simple things that folks like yourself in the academy can do to remind us that knowledge matters because it gives us greater understanding of what is real, and not, again, just simply for the sake of scholarly debates that end nowhere?
Well, I mean, this is one of those things that actually I don't think is all that complicated. It's just like in sports, when you don't want to get up and go for that run. I mean, it's just do it.
Do
You
it.
just have to do it. I mean, it's what you're doing, Rob. It's what Great Hearts is doing. You just one day, I don't know how you did this, but you said this has to be done. And if you build it, it turns out people will come. And so you're building an empire of classical education. And when I was back at Villanova, I heard of Great Hearts. Jerry came to our school, and I was asked, can she come into our class and talk about this? I said, sure. And I think the next week I had somebody coming in from Teach America. Wow, two entirely different philosophies of teaching and education. And I found it very fascinating to watch my students listen to both, at different times and then talk about the difference. From Teach America, they said that you have to teach down because everybody has to be included. And so some of my students asked, does that mean that, you're sort of dumbing down and you make sure that you don't do too much and you don't really ask questions that are, and the representative said yes, because you want everybody to be part of it. And then the Great Hearts person, Jerry, said no, because the students knew these questions and said, you challenge the students, you set standards. And when you set standards, you don't be surprised that people rise to those standards. So
oh my gosh. That's a great, well, there's one of the pleasures of the academy, right? When you have outfitted a cadre of students who can discern what is really needed. Those students knew the difference and were drawn to the Great Hearts model, not surprisingly, under your tutelage. Are there any other pleasures we should know of? Again, we'll avoid the academic politics. We'll steer clear of that. What are the things
those are the difficulties?
Yeah, that's the difficulties, right?
The pleasures are real simple. The students. That's why you do it. In fact, Rob, of my three closest friends, I mean, one of them is my husband. He's my best friend. My other two closest friends, one was my mentor and one was my student. Aristotle knew what he was talking about when he talked about the friendship that can develop between teacher and student. It's just this magical thing that creates genuine concern and love for each other. Because it's about loving the same things that are worth loving.
So true. So true. You're just giving me that longing, that sense, that Sehnsucht, right? Oh, I want to be back in the classroom. Yeah. But we've got work to do, and hopefully build a Republican empire. Is such a thing possible? With your reference to the empire, we're definitely doing our best at the Great Arts Institute to continue to build and establish schools, and then those leaders and certainly the teachers who run these classrooms. The importance of this work reminds me of one of the challenging episodes in your career. And this is public record, of course. You and James Matthew Wilson wrote an article in the Wall Street Journal back in 2019 to detail some of it and your concern with your host institution, Villanova. You kind of ran afoul of what I have to say are institutional trends in higher education. I'm just interested, if you could, to give us the core of your concern there. What was going on, just in brief, What do we need to be worried about? You went public, you went national with the Wall Street Journal. What was the heart of the matter there?
Well, they had put some questions on the student evaluations that were really political litmus tests for the professors. Is your professor, sufficient? I mean, they asked all the politically correct questions, and the students were supposed to judge us on our politics. And of course, we all know that student evaluations are really weighted heavily for people in tenure decisions, promotion decisions, and so forth. And so for over a year, James Matthew and I had been writing separately to various people in the administration, asking them to take these questions off because it wasn't the appropriate place for them on the student evaluation to test people for their politics. And we gave all kinds of arguments why. And nothing was done, and we just couldn't get anywhere. So finally, we wrote an article, and the Wall Street Journal published it. The basic problem is you shouldn't be judged for politics in the classroom. I mean, I teach politics as a very different thing than making the classroom political, because what happens is instead of free inquiry, you have fear. It becomes a classroom of fear. The professor is afraid to really teach. The students are afraid to really ask questions and to learn. It's not just of the teacher, it's the student too, that you're supposed to walk the line. And students told me that over and over again. They were feeling that way as well. So, I mean, all we were asking for was genuine liberal education, the freedom to pursue the questions and the truth. Actually, those questions, as far as I know, are still on the evaluations.
Well, it just seems so obvious on the face of it that we would want, as you say, a freedom to inquire, to explore, to understand more deeply, to question our assumptions. But that seems to be in abeyance. This seems to be less and less common in higher education today, and it obviously prompted you to make a move. You're now at the Arizona State University and, as I said, the SCETL, School for Civic and Economic Thought and Leadership. This new school is dedicated to liberal education, even launched a master's degree a couple of years ago, which you helped to support and lead. How would you describe SCETL's approach to liberal education, right? And how might it contribute to the current debate in higher education?
Well, SCETL is genuinely committed to liberal education, and I am so grateful, not only that there's this department, they call them schools at ASU, that is actually doing this despite the trend in education otherwise, and that the dean and the president of the university support this. This is an amazing thing these days. This is a state university where we are really allowed to raise questions and not be in fear that we will lose our jobs. I don't think we should be in fear. I hope not.
Of course not.
And so the MA program, for example, takes the Western heritage seriously, and it's interdisciplinary. It includes politics, philosophy, literature, history, some science and logic. And the goal is to seriously inquire into the abiding human questions, and also the questions of civic life. And what we are doing essentially is preparing teachers who can teach, citizens who can participate, and statesmen and stateswomen for the future.
It's a little, I want to say it's shocking, although of course this has been a long time coming. But the things you've just said and the way you've characterized SCETL would seem to be just the essential or fundamental approach to liberal education that we would want to see in colleges and universities across the country.
Yeah.
But you're telling me that's not that this is an outlier. This is an exception to what is essentially the rule within higher education.
It is. It is, Rob. I mean, we're not the only one.
Right.
St. John's has been doing it for years. St. John's in Annapolis and Santa Fe. There are other schools, Grove City, Dallas is doing a very good job. There are some schools doing this, but it really, and there are some programs, what ACTA calls oases in higher ed, and which this is happening at various schools. And so and the interesting thing is the students, when they find this, they tell their friends. And it tends to be the really good students. Now, why? It's not just that we attract only really good students. It's that but it's any student who comes tends to become a good student because, a fire is lit under them because we're asking the kinds of questions, and they're asking the kind of questions that matter. All of a sudden, education becomes a way of life, not just a drudgery to get through, to get the degree, to get a job you don't like.
So true. So true. A Mrs. Booth encounter, right, for these students that launches them into ever deeper waters. I think that's wonderful. And I'm glad you mentioned the American Council of Trustees and Alumni. Michael Polikoff, the president, and that organization has been very, very supportive of what's happening in classical education. Michael himself is a classicist, but of course, he's a classicist with a very democratic, small d democratic spirit, because he would love to see the classics and the tradition conveyed to as many of the next generation as possible. So you're so right to say we've just got to find those few, those self-selecting few who come to us, who are inspired by a classical liberal education, and then go and tell their friends, right? It's got to become that kind of viral movement, to use the words of our day.
Yeah, I don't know if you know this about Michael, Rob.
You did?
You probably do. His specialty is the Greek art of war.
Yes, that's right. And perhaps the most irenic and pacific individual you'll ever meet, right? Such a peaceful and gentle man, but a scholar and one who knows well the art and craft of war. Well,
he's tougher than you think.
What's that?
He's tougher than you might.
Oh, there's no question in my mind. It's just that he's a true gentleman, so that when he presents, you won't know what he's got under there. I wouldn't tussle with him, that's for sure.
Yeah.
So, Colleen, you're going to be joining us at the symposium, the National Symposium for Classical Education. It's part of the reason I wanted to have you on today. And we've got two sessions that you're going to preside over. It's fascinating because we don't normally place James Madison, the founder you've already represented or referenced earlier and written about, with Jane Austen, who's also of great interest to you. What's the connection here between the politician and the author that brought them into your work?
That is a really good question. I actually discovered Jane Austen when I was 14, taking a book off of the uncle I told you about. He married a teacher who was a literature teacher. And so they had these books in their house, and they said I could borrow them anytime I wanted. And when I had finished all the murder mysteries, and I had to go start reading her English books. So I pulled down Pride and Prejudice and loved it, but it wasn't, and that was it. That I read that. And then in graduate school, I was looking for a bed. I didn't have a bed, so I was going to garage sales to find something to sleep on. And because I had no money, and there was this book, The Collected Writings of Jane Austen. I think it was $1. I still have it upstairs. And I said, I can afford that. I brought it home, and I didn't come out of my room till I had read I just went from one, I just read and read, she wrote 6 novels. So James Madison, I'd been studying for a while because as I said, I was interested in these questions of, America and justice, and I don't know why. I just always was. When I read Jefferson in high school, I just found it fascinating. Yeah. Both Jane Austen and James Madison are late 18th, early 19th century.
Right.
That's something.
Contemporaries, right?
But they're both concerned, Rob, with the question of character. And in more of a similar way than you might think. They're both concerned about how we should live our lives and how we should treat others. So Austen, that's pretty evident, right? Elizabeth Bennet at Pemberley. I never knew myself, right? It's this coming to know oneself, by which she means it's the Socratic question, know thyself,
Right.
which means know what it means to be human, and what that means in terms of how you should think about what you do and how you live. And so this is all through Austen and every heroine, and then probably the heroes too. Why is Mary Crawford not the heroine of Mansfield Park? I mean, everything about her, she's beautiful, she's charming, she's witty, she is smart. Fanny Price doesn't have any of those things. What is Austen up to? What about Emma? We wonder what will become of her. Handsome, clever, and rich, but she's clueless. That's why they make the movie Clueless, based on Emma, because she doesn't understand that she doesn't get it. She's in need of an education. Emma is about education. Emma has a lot to learn. Now, how does this have anything to do with Madison? What Madison is really, I think, up to is trying to figure out how to make small r republicanism, free government, work. It had been a failure all through history. It could not sustain itself. And what he figures out and what he understands, all these processes that he figures out, he takes separation of powers, checks and balances, bicameralism, all these things from Montesquieu and others. But what Madison understands is this, that behind the laws are human beings. Somebody makes these laws, and what they think, what they believe, what they cherish, what they denigrate is going to determine the kind of laws they make. And so character matters. You cannot have a republic without Republican citizens. Small r republic. The character of Republicans is what will sustain a regime, or if it's corrupted, will destroy a regime. That's what Gibbon's Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire, I think, is ultimately about.
Character. You knew that I was going to ask this question, so we talked about it just prior to getting on. But as we, and that's the K-12 folks that I work with, and certainly the collegiate university professorate that you represent, as we together seek to advance liberal education in this country, I have to say then the top of the list, because I was going to ask you, what are the top 2 or 3 things we can do to distinguish what we're up to from what I have to identify as the mainstream, kind of the status quo in education. And it sounds like character's at the top of the list. We've got to attend to character. But what are the top 2 or 3 in your list? I don't want to populate it for you.
Okay. Well, so I gave this a real moment's thought in the few minutes that you gave me to think about it. But I think some of it's pretty clear. First of all, we need to teach the teachers well. In the departments of education in most colleges and universities across America, we're not really doing that. These departments of education, if I can put it this way, have something to learn, it seems to me. So that's one thing. The second thing is at the level of the state, where we determine educational policy, we have to have school choice, because our public schools, unfortunately, are failing the children. I am all for making the public schools better. I went to public schools all my life. That's great, but not at the expense of the children. When I hear this problem of creaming and what about the schools, Rob, here's my response. I understand that. Okay. But the fundamental question isn't what about the schools? It's what about the kids?
What about the children?
They have to be put first. And I would say, finally, one of the central problems with education is the same as the central problem with America. And maybe we'd phrase it this way. Do we still hold these truths? Do we think there's any such thing as truth at all that's anything other than one's personal truth and preference? If we're not even open to that possibility in education, there can't be education.
That's right.
And in the United States, we're a nation built on certain truths that have to do with what it means to be human and how we treat each other. And if we lose that, then we lose America. So the challenge is right before us. And it's one that we don't really have any choice but to try to meet.
Couldn't have said it better. You still have that question deep inside, burning through you. What is justice? How are we to do it? And it sounds like we're going to have to get those teachers prepared. We're going to have to give our students and our communities opportunities and really some alternatives, right, for their schooling of their children so that they can have a Mrs. Booth encounter.
Yeah.
And we've got to commit ourselves afresh to the truth. Colleen Sheehan, Professor Sheehan, it has been such a pleasure to spend this time with you. And of course, you're coming, well, you're here in Phoenix, but you're going to be at the symposium to offer us both your accounting of Madison and Austin. That's a doubleheader that nobody should miss. Thank you for your time today and look forward to seeing you next month.
Thank you, Rob. And keep sending the Great Hearts teachers over to SCETL. They are fabulous. Thanks.
Thank you. Registration for the 2023 National Symposium for Classical Education is now open. Join us February 22nd through the 24th in Phoenix, Arizona for 3 days of unsurpassed scholarship, professional workshops, and networking opportunities. For more information, visit www.greathearts.institute. Working together to renew the tradition.